Welcome. Today's topic is going to be the introduction of philosophy. In this case, I'm going to discuss two things briefly in this video. The first thing I'm going to discuss are the different approaches to teaching philosophy, so that while some of you may have already had a philosophy class and recognize that I may approach it differently than another professor, I want you to note that there are several different methods by which professors will approach the subject and several different vantage points and things they find are that important. Secondly, then I'm going to discuss the nature of philosophy, what it is and why it is important that we should learn such a discipline. So without further ado, the first thing I want to do is I want to discuss the fact that there are different approaches to teaching philosophy. For example, many of you, if you've already had a philosophy class, you might have encountered the professor teaching it as though it were a history class. And thus what you will learn is that there are different philosophers that range all back towards and past the classical era and up to it. Then you'll lead into the contemporary times, and the idea is that they will highlight the different famous philosophers from each era, and in doing so show the differences in how people thought and how those philosophical changes have affected society. Now, that is a fine approach, and I actually believe that that is highly important, and without that approach, we would also have a hard time recognizing that changes in philosophical views correlate with the changing of governments throughout history and the different various movements, be it political or ethical, throughout history. You could always correlate those with different changes in philosophy. So this is a great approach, but this is not necessarily the approach I take. Another approach is the interesting topic approach. This is where a professor will come in and say, well, we have an instance of what's going on in culture today. What do you think about this, and how might we solve these issues? Now, this too is an important approach to philosophy, specifically because we do deal with topics every day. We live our lives and encounter the goings-on of the world, and we want to know how should we then live given what is happening around us. And so these topics emerge, and we want to know how we must deal with them in the life. And thus I also find that to be a great approach to the subject. Finally, and this is generally the approach I take, is that I break my philosophy classes down into the three main subdivisions, and from these subdivisions we will solve these problems or approach these interesting concepts. And we could also see throughout history that that is exactly what the philosophers of the past were doing, and thus what we're really doing is learning how to do the things that the philosophers of which we know, like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Kant, Leibniz, Hume, and the others, we learn to do what they were doing. And thus we become philosophers in our own right. Will we become famous philosophers? Well, I would love to think that our names will one day be written down in books, but I think what we really should be content with is that we have learned to approach subjects from the more philosophical approach, in that we can solve these problems that come upon us on a day-to-day basis, or that even if we can't solve them, we could understand them and we could look at them with a little more clarity than we have in the past, and that we can also see where other individuals are coming from when they solve those problems, that they may have some philosophical predisposition that has led them to a conclusion, and perhaps it's even unreflective. So that is the reason I choose this, is because I want you guys to become aware of the philosophical predispositions that you have. I want you to be aware of how you might have gotten these philosophical predispositions over time, and then I want you to be able to assess whether or not you should continue to hold on to those presumptions that you have, or maybe should you change them ever so slightly, or even just cast them out all aside for no other reason than you were wrong, and thus you want to become more correct in your understanding of the world in which you live. So, with that is one of the reasons, obviously, or one of the two topics I wanted to discuss, the different approaches. I want you to note that if you ever take any other philosophy class, they may come at it from this approach. If not, they will come at it probably from one of those other two means. Now, the way I do it is, again, I will break it down into its three areas of study. If you are a philosophy major, you will eventually take courses in all three of these. So let me list them now. First is epistemology. Epistemology is going to study theories of knowledge, what it means to know. It's going to discuss how we know, what counts as knowledge, what is required of knowledge. Now, these are going to be called necessary and sufficient conditions. What do you have to have? And in other words, what is necessary for one to have knowledge? What can you not get away with? If you do not have this, you do not have knowledge. And that's one question we ask in epistemology. The other one is, what is sufficient for knowledge? That if you have this is good enough. You don't need any more, and we can work with that. You just say, I know this, I have this, such and such, whatever property of the situation is, you've obtained it, and you have knowledge now, and you don't need to go any further. Now, those are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, but then we want to break down, obviously, the different parts of knowledge. Now, this will be a topic for another video. The other discipline is going to be metaphysics. So the first discipline under philosophy is going to be metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is going to study what philosophers will call the world. Now, by the world, philosophers will mean everything that exists, everything in reality. Now, of course, some metaphysicians might say that what we intend to study is reality, and that's fine too. Under this category, you will find what's called ontology. Now, ontology is the study of existence. Ontology is going to ask the question, what does it mean to exist? What are the types of things that exist? And from that, we want to know, can we know that these things exist? Or even another question, if we don't know they exist, does it follow that they do not exist? Is knowledge of such entities required or necessary, as I said before, necessary for the existence of such and such a thing? Then finally, we are going to touch on the third area of philosophy, or I should say major area of philosophy, that is ethics. Now, ethics is going to study moral theory. It asks the question, what does it mean to be good? Is there such thing as good and evil? What does it mean to say murder is evil? Now, one could say killing is not always evil, but murder is always evil. We want to know what that word evil is. On the other hand, we want to know what it means when somebody says altruism is good, that is self-sacrifice. Is giving of yourself selfishly, even at your own expense, is that a good thing? Is that a good and right thing? Ought we do this? And in ethics, we want to know a couple things. We're going to apply epistemology and metaphysics to ethics. We want to know, can we know what it means to be good? And even moreover, if we know what it means to be good, can we know what objects are good, or what things are good, or actions are good? And so once we know what it would mean, will we know how to apply it? Now, if we go back to epistemology and determine that one cannot know anything, then one cannot know anything about certain things like existence questions in metaphysics. Therefore, they would not be able to know if such things, such as, God, numbers, moral value statements, if they exist. And thus, in the end, if we do not know anything, then we cannot know moral statements, much less how to apply them. So, what we're going to find out is that metaphysics and ethics are deeply affected by epistemology. Now, epistemology is also going to be affected by the other two. Metaphysics, given that it studies everything that exists, we would want to know, does knowledge exist? Is this an object of existence of which we perceive? Is there such thing as truth of which we are aware? Moreover, what about ethics? How does that affect epistemology? Ethics can affect epistemology in asking ourselves, do we have an obligation to be intellectually virtuous? Do we have an obligation to strive to know things? Or is ignorance bliss? Is it okay to remain without knowledge, unwise, with folly? So we can see that while epistemology will affect metaethics or metaphysics and ethical issues, we could also see that ethics will affect epistemology, as will metaphysics affect epistemology, and metaphysics will also affect ethics. So what we find is, though there are many approaches to philosophy, the approach I'm going to take, again, is one from these three areas: epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And the reason is because they are interrelated, and from these we can decide bigger topics such as issues in philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, philosophy of, politics. So you'd have political philosophy. Philosophy of mind. Now these things are all going to be touched on by the three main areas of inquiry. And there will be a couple others. One will be methodology, and another one will be logic. And those will be tools, of course, that are used. And those are going to be integrated in each one of those three disciplines. And you will either take a separate course on them, or you will learn them as you go throughout philosophy. Now, if you are, as I said, a guy who's intending to, or girl who's intending to study philosophy as your major, what you will end up ultimately taking is a degree plan that offers probably an introduction to ethics, a class on epistemology, a class on metaphysics, a class on ethics. And then you will take upper level courses that apply these areas to your area of interest. For example, you would be taking in certain metaphysical courses such as philosophy of mind or consciousness. You could take in ethics courses metaethics, or you could take ethics focused on bioethics, or ethics of war, just war theory, in other words. If you're an epistemologist and you are going to focus on areas of knowledge, you could focus on, for example, religious epistemology. What would it mean to know that there are such things as religious truths? You can focus on such things as, philosophy of science. Is science by nature the only way to know things? Or what does it mean to be science? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions? Now, I will have lectures on every one of these eventually. But for now, I want you to understand that these three areas, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, are the three main courses, so to speak, from which you will jump off into any philosophy degree. Now, that's why the introduction to philosophy only gives you a little helping of each, and it wants to literally introduce you. So, if you understand that I'm going at it from not a historical approach and not an interesting question approach, though these will be used in any introductory course, so it will be history and will be interesting questions, I want you to understand why I want you to be introduced to those main three themes or courses in philosophy. It is because from those you can make these bigger decisions and explore those greater options. So with that, I want you to pay attention to the next lecture, which will start you off with the nature of philosophy. What is philosophy by nature? And how do we understand it?